Religion and politics. It is a well-known feature of Palestinian politics during the Mandate that the Christians, of whom the great majority were Orthodox, seemed to make common cause with the Muslims in the struggle against Zionism. They, or at least the leaders who claimed to speak in their name, asserted that both Muslims and Christians were part of the Arab nation and that this fact made their solidarity natural and inevitable. The circumstances of Palestine under the Mandate were, of course, exceptional, placing a small religious minority, anxious to survive unscathed, in quite a difficult position, and it is possible to argue that expediency and prudence made identification with the majority attractive, but it was quite late in the history of the Mandate before it became finally apparent that the mandatory had decided no longer to advance Zionist interests at the price of Arab antagonism. Until 1939 or thereabouts, expediency might also have counselled a measure, at least, of acquiescence in British policy and in Zionist expansion, seeing that the British were the masters in Palestine and that the prudent have a lively respect for their masters. But the articulate leaders of the Orthodox Christian community never deviated in the least from the Muslim line in Palestine. Their policy did not seem dictated by expediency. On the contrary, shrewd and experienced observers remarked more than once on the fervent commitment of Orthodox Christians to the ideals of Arab nationalism and their wholehearted involvement in the nationalist struggle. Thus, in 1926, Bertram Young, reporting on the controversies opposing the Patriarchate and the Orthodox laity, said with accents of conviction, "National consciousness is not a matter of what ought to be felt, but of what actually is felt. No amount of eloquent reasoning could persuade the inhabitants of Alsace-Lorraine that their true national consciousness is German. Similarly, no amount of such reasoning would persuade the Orthodox congregation of Palestine that they are not Arabs. The dearest thought of every young local Orthodox Christian is that he is an Arab and his most cherished aspirations are those of Arab nationalism," which he shares with his Muslim fellow countrymen. Some 10 years later, Professor Hancock, visiting Palestine, was also struck by the seeming solidarity of Muslim and Christian. The British government, he writes, had taken over the Turkish tradition of classifying the population of Palestine by confessional allegiance, the categories under which the census officials grouped their figures of births and deaths, immigration and emigration, employment, education, and the rest were Jews, Muslims, Christians, others. This classification fitted the facts of Jewish solidarity, and on the Zionist side was in effect a classification by nationality. But it is completely ignored the national solidarity which on the Arab side was transcending the old distinction between Muslim and Christian. To the outside world, this solidarity was illustrated by the career of George Antonius, an Orthodox Christian who resigned from a high post in the mandatory administration in protest against British policies, and then wrote The Arab Awakening, the most eloquent, able, and influential expedition of Arab nationalist claims that has so far been written. And there were other Orthodox Christians less well known outside Syria and Palestine, but quite prominent in their own community and in the nationalist movement, men such as Rafiq Rizik Salum, the Orthodox lawyer from Homs who had been intended for the priesthood, but who deserted the Orthodox seminary at Belmont for the Syrian Protestant College at Beirut and the Imperial Law College at Istanbul, became an Arab nationalist and was hanged by Jamal Pasha at Damascus in 1915. Men also such as Issa al-Issa, editor of the Jafar newspaper Filastin, and a member of the Neshebi faction, which went under the title of the National Defense Party. Yaqub Faraj, president of the Arab Orthodox Executive Committee, a prominent member of the Muslim Christian Society, which operated in the early days of British administration, and later one of the 9 members of the Arab Higher Executive Committee, set up in 1936 under the Mufti's chairmanship, or his cousin Khalil Sakakini, at one time secretary of the Executive Committee of the Arab Congress of Palestine, which functioned in the 1920s, and for many years a high official in the Palestine Education Department, whose diary, published posthumously a few years ago, affords striking evidence of the state of mind of the educated class of his community and generation. And yet the unanimous witnesses, the emphatic declarations, the clear commitment are not enough to banish or puzzlement. These Orthodox Christians, living for centuries under the dominance on the fringes of Muslim society, are suddenly found asserting that they are no mere political minority, but part and parcel of the Arab nation, equally entitled with the Muslims. Should this nation achieve sovereignty to the exercise of political power, the reactions of the Muslims to such claims, should it be attempted seriously to make them good, we may leave on one side, for the habit of power stoutly held for centuries would enable them to deal with these easily and confidently. The situation of the Orthodox themselves is more difficult and more interesting. In order to convince themselves, if not others, that they formed part of the Arab nation, they would have to reject what they had governed the social arrangements of their community for countless generations, and provided a sense of identity with their fathers and fathers' fathers. In the past, they had been members of a religious community, and this membership at once defined their status and set the bounds of their public as of their private activity. Loyalty did not extend beyond the community, and traffic between communities was confined to an inescapable minimum of externals. But now this religion suddenly seemed a badge of servitude. Membership of the Arab nation had a price, which Muslims, being the majority and the rulers, did not have to pay. It meant the abandonment of communal organisation and the defiant assertion that religion was a strictly private affair, and that it could not be the constitutive principle of a society. That it had no political and little social significance. This radical change of view is a matter so intimate and so fundamental came abruptly, and if only because abrupt, it must also have been violent, creating schism and discord within the community. When, therefore, outside observers reported the solidarity of Christians and Muslims, were they not perhaps unwittingly echoing the claims and professions of the victorious party in a species of civil war which had raged inside the Orthodox Christian community? Such a view is supported by the experience which similar communities underwent as a result of the sudden impact of new theological and political ideas imported from outside. The Armenian nationalists, for instance, seeking to transform the Armenian community of the Ottoman Empire into a European nation-state, succeeded in establishing a hegemony among their people only after a sanguinary struggle with other Armenians who opposed these ambitions and who were inclined to achieve some compromise with the Ottoman authorities. And before the Zionists could become a powerful party among the Eastern European Jews, they had to surmount the formidable and relentless opposition of the religious and secular leaders of their communities. Strife was undoubtedly embittered by the intrusive character of the new ideas. They did not arise within the communities they affected so profoundly, but were brought in from the outside with superior airs. The supporters of the old order, considering these notions the invention of misguided unbelievers or diabolical persecutors, rejected them with horror and never attempted to discriminate between innovations which they could accept and those which they had to reject. Those who were attracted to them, therefore, became easily disaffected and were forced into radical attitudes and uncompromising postures. It is interesting to notice that such strife and the extremism it engendered never seriously affected the Maronite community. Can the cause be the Maronite connection with the Roman Catholic Church? So alive to the European intellectual currents and so skilled and experienced in shielding its charges from disruptive influences. For outsiders were not left alone to introduce the Maronites to European ideas and methods. These were mediated through the educational enterprise of Roman Catholic orders, who would naturally exert all their efforts to combat the notion that modernity and religion were hopelessly opposed, and that modernity was necessarily superior. But even among the Maronites, things could easily have been quite different. In 1825, American Protestant missionaries came to Beirut and attempted to gain converts among the local Christian population. The Maronite Patriarch reacted strongly to their activities and issued two manifestos, first in 1824 and again in 1829, ordering the members of his community to avoid all contact with them, whether in religious or temporal matters. Nobody was to handle their publications or attend their prayer meetings or frequent their schools or take service or have financial relations with them. Let them hereby, said the Patriarch in a second manifesto, be excluded from all Christian society. Let the curse cover them as a garment and sink into their members as an oil and make them wither as the fig tree which the mouth of the Lord has cursed. The evil spirit shall also take possession of them, torturing them day and night, and no one shall visit or greet them. Disobedience led to excommunication. A young Maronite, Asad al-Shiadiak, publicly embraced the teachings of the missionaries. He now declared that he had never before been a believer, according to the living true faith, that it would be but a lie if I should say I believed as the Romish Church does, and that by reason and learning, and prayer to God, with purity and motive, we may know from the Holy Scripture everything necessary to our salvation. The religion which he had been brought up, he now became persuaded, was hopelessly sunk in superstition and corruption. Eventually the Patriarch had Assad imprisoned at his seat, where he died shortly afterwards. His youngest brother, Faris, was also attracted to the missionaries' doctrine, and became fond, as the Maronite Bishop of Beirut put it, of reasoning on the subject of religion. His family disapproved greatly of his behaviour, the more so that they feared it might influence his brother Assad's fate for the worse, and he clashed with his eldest brother, Mansur. He fled to the missionaries, declaring that I will either go to a place in this country where I can enjoy my liberty, or I'll take ship and leave the country altogether. The missionaries put Faris aboard a ship for Malta and employed him at their printing press there. He became a famous Arabic writer, ended by embracing Islam, and died a pensioner of the Sultan and a notable advocate of his pan-Islamic pretensions. His best-known work, a curious autobiography, contains a sustained diatribe descending at times to obscenity and foul language against the hypocrisy and cupidity of the Maronite clergy. In a passage bemoaning the misfortune of his brother, he says to the Maronite hierarchy, "And even if my brother discussed religion controversially and said that you were mistaken, you had no right to kill him for this." Among the Maronites, Faris al-Shidiak was not the only one to rebel against his religion and community. There was also the writer Adib Ishak, who, when he died in Beirut, was refused a Catholic burial. He was outspoken and intemperate in denouncing the clerical power in the East, but seemed to attribute its corruption to Western example. Towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, anti-clericalism, allied with Freemasonry, in fact knew some vogue among educated Maronites in Lebanon and in America. The most famous example of this anti-clericalism was that of the writer of Amin al-Rayhani. Rayhani went to the United States as a boy of 13, and it was there, in fact, that he began his literary career, with an onslaught on religious dogma and institutions. In 1903, he published a satire, The Triple Alliance in the Animal Kingdom, which he followed a year later by another diatribe, The Muleteer and the Priest. In the first of these works, he pictures the clergy in the guise of an ass, a mule, and a horse. These three animals are challenged by a fox, who denounces the superstitions which they purvey in order to resist the march of progress and preserve their power over their followers. "I do not believe in your God," he exclaims. "I hate your Jehovah. I recognize no authority, and I absolutely deny your allegation that God Almighty has given you authority over us." The three animals thus challenged kill the fox, who becomes a martyr to his beliefs. But shortly afterwards, they themselves are overtaken and run over by a railway train, that symbol of progress. The muleteer and the priest takes up the theme with virulence. A muleteer of the Lebanese mountains is made anti-clerical by his experience of oppression and deceit at the hands of the clergy. While on the journey in a carriage from Beirut to the mountain, he meets a Maronite priest as a fellow passenger, and he proceeds to harangue him. "You vow," he tells him, "the three vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty. These are the vows which are known to the people, but you also take a fourth vow. You take it in secret. You then take the vow that you will not be bound by your vows." The priest is converted by the muleteer's cogency and eloquence. He writes to his son, who is studying theology at Rome, to give up the priesthood which God but does not sanction, and that the church is an invention by means of which its heads are able to accumulate wealth. He abandons his parish and takes up an itinerant life, preaching the new tidings in company with the muleteer. In the final episode recording Asad al-Shidiak's fate, the patriarch has him imprisoned in a monastery on the pretext that he is a madman, where he is beaten by the monks and finally dies. In a letter to a friend from this period, Amin Rayhani declares that the Syrian people had hitherto been the anvil silently receiving the blows of the clerical hammer. It was to deliver them at last from this fate that the young Armin embarked on this campaign, which exposed him to the bitter hostility of the Maronite and Catholic clergy. But what did he have to offer in place of this superstition? He offered a syncretism of perhaps a natural religion which men should recognise as common to them all, a belief free of dogma and unencumbered with the specific and the positive. He wanted his fellow Syrians to become what he himself claimed to be, Christian with the Gospels and Muslim with the Quran. Fanaticism would then disappear and the Syrians would be launched on the road of progress and prosperity. As he wrote to a correspondent, "I have no doubt that the Muslim who loves a Christian and would marry her, or the Christian who loves a Muslim and would marry her, is so elevated in his morals, his intellect, and his behaviour, that he may neglect some, or many, of the traditions of his kin and people. I consider," he went on, "that intermarriage today between the two groups is one of the most important conditions for our reform and progress. The social and religious toleration, which will grow in a home composed of these two elements, is the only remedy for all our religious and social ills. Nay, it is the elixir of our new life." As for the children who will be the fruit of this marriage, the question of teaching them religious principles is simple. Let them read something from the Gospel and the Quran, and let them sometimes go to this and sometimes to that place of worship, until they reach their majority. They will then have the freedom of worshipping as they choose and may pray wherever their reason and their conscience directs. His fellow Maronites and writer Maroun Aboud, 1886 to 1962, subscribed to something like these beliefs and called one of his sons Muhammad. Armin al-Rayhani congratulates him on this gesture and writes that if the Muslims, the Druze, and the Jews were to follow his example, a new generation of brethren, of true brethren, would arise in the country who, outside their places of worship, would not be able to distinguish between Christian and Muslim and Jew. But this natural and universal religion was not as easy and rational as it seemed on the surface. Consider Marun Abud, who in the cause of religious amity had named one of his sons Muhammad. His friendly feelings towards Islam and also and characteristically been preceded by a clash with his own religious authorities. In 1934, he published a poem in celebration of the Prophet Muhammad in which he praised for unifying a nation divided by religious fanaticism. The poet deplores religious divisions, but what difference can there be between a Marun, a Christian name, and Marwan, a Muslim name? And he goes on to declaim, "Let the generations bow and reverence whenever the most pure prophet from Adnan is mentioned, who has filled the world with the name of God and has called the people of the earth to unity." Let the fanatics go on croaking. The bird of paradise is not harmed by the mouthings of the crows. It would seem, then, that in this new universal religion, a privileged place is accorded to Islam and its prophet. The reason, we may suspect, is that in abjuring the tradition of their community as superstitious and divisive, in refusing to be identified as Maronites, men like Marun Abud and Amin al-Rayhani find that they have to seek a new identity for themselves, and that this syncretistic universalism which they preach cannot readily supply this identity. If their syncretism had not precluded them from it, they would have perhaps gladly identified themselves as Muslims and taken their place within a dominant, self-confident group. For them, not so much Islam as a system of belief, but the Muslim community as a powerful, cohesive group, exercised a tremendous fascination. It is this fascination which may explain Marun Abud's poem in praise of the Prophet, and a statement such as this by Rehani. The Muslims are more devoted in their patriotism and have a sounder view of it than the Christians. They demand complete independence without a mandate or similar pretext. This is absolutely clear. The Christians, on the other hand, invoke patriotism but ask for an incomplete independence which is supervised by this or that power. The Christian minority will, it seems, remain a minority and will diminish daily owing to immigration, while the Muslim majority will remain a majority. The Christians, therefore, will remain in need of protection, and the permanent protection is imperialism. Christianity, then, is not only superstition and corruption, it is also an instrument of imperialism. Were it possible to find an Islam without dogmas, it would surely provide an escape from it. And providentially, after the First World War, such an Islam came to hand. For Rouhani and those who thought like him, it was known as Arabism, and it was Arabism who came to provide for them a new identity in place of the traditional one which they had discarded. Characteristically, just as the rejection of the Maronite tradition was the outcome of exposure to Western thought, so Arabism also was drawn from Western literature. Rayhani tells us that when he left the Lebanon as a boy, in his breast was fear of those whose language he spoke and hatred for them, some of those whose blood is flowed in his veins. In the New World, he came across Carlyle's essay on Muhammad in Heroes and Hero Worship, and I felt for the first time some love for the Arabs and became inclined to seek out more of their history. He then discovered Washington Irving's book on the Alhambra and began to dream of the ancient Arab glories. He sought out Orientalist works in the New York Public Library and found them in Poetry Prophecy, the desert oases in oceans of sand, and the date trees in the oases, through the branches of which whispers the breeze and the trunks of which are shaken by the hot desert wind. He also finds in them the voice of the Sakia, singing to the blessed earth under the shade of the date trees, and the Bedouin girl singing to the camel of the Sakia. This he finds in the books in the New York Public Library, an enchantment which removes him utterly from the drabness of the bursting and crowding city, where he has to earn his keep by balancing the books of his uncle's export-import business. It was this Western exoticism which at length provided a new identity for Rouhani and made of him an Arab nationalist, preaching that the Maronite, the Druze, the Shiite, and the Sunni had to forget that they were Maronite, Druze, Shiite, or Sunni, and to remember only that they were Arab. Arabism brings us together, he exclaims. Arabism unites us. Arabism it is which creates that strength which the Europeans respect, a strength which can never be defeated or brought low. They all had to forget their particular identity, but we may suspect, not all equally, it is the Maronites and other non-Muslims who had to forget most, who had, as Rouhani put it in his political testament written in 1931, so to unite with the Arabs, so to coalesce with them, intellectually, morally, and spiritually, that no majority or minority would subsist. On a visit to Ibn Saud, he proclaimed that if the Arab cause required him to become a Wahhabi, he would become one. It is quite inconceivable that he should demand reciprocity, that if the necessities of the Arab cause required Ibn Saud to become a Christian, then he should have become one. He is terribly flattered that Ibn Saud should describe him as a true Arab, and seems unconscious of the king's patronising attitude when he continued, He is more devoted to the Arabs than the Arabs themselves, and nobler than many Muslims. In rebelling against his community and religion, and finally becoming a Muslim and an advocate of pan-Islam, Faris al-Shidiak was very much the exception in his generation. So on the whole, were Adib Ishaq, Amin al-Rayhani and Maron Abud in their rebellions and in their cause, which had chosen substitution for their ancestral faith. Different circumstances made this kind of rebellion in other communities more common and more effective. This was the case in the Orthodox Christian community in Palestine. Its situation was peculiar enough. The Patriarchate of Jerusalem, like its neighbours to the north, the Patriarchate of Antioch, was composed mainly of an Arabic-speaking laity. But in both patriarchates, the clergy, with the exception of the village priests, was Greek. In Jerusalem, the Patriarch holding as usual in the Ottoman Empire both temporal and spiritual power, together with the metropolitan bishops and archimandrites, was always recruited from the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre, an old monastic order which under its modern constitution dates from 1662. The order was a closed corporation. The Patriarch was an ex officio president of the Brotherhood, and it admitted none but Greeks to its membership. On entering the order, the members took the vows of obedience and chastity, but not the vow of poverty. They were paid salaries and they could hold property which, however, if immovable, reverted on their death to the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood was rich and disposed of important revenues derived from bequests left by the pious in Russia, the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire, and from the donations of Orthodox pilgrims to the holy places. As for the parish priests, their position was quite wretched. They were drawn from the Arabic-speaking laity, they had little education and received very little pay. An observer writing before the First World War remarked that though there existed an Orthodox theological college in Jerusalem, the natives, with one or two exceptions, were excluded from it. The parish priests, he reported, were paid for Sunday masses from church funds at a rate varying from 20 to 82 cents, and received similar fees from the faithful for baptisms, marriages, and funerals. These priests were not properly recruited, their position in many cases being quasi-hereditary, and it was not unusual to see different clans in the village using the services of different priests. The situation seems to have continued much the same after the war, but a subsequent writer also remarks on the paucity of their knowledge as of their income. The Patriarch was not only the spiritual head of his community, on him also devolved, or should have devolved, responsibility for its temporal welfare, for the Ottoman government provided neither education nor medical services, nor care for the old. Such services were a communal responsibility, and in Jerusalem their provision was elementary. Here again, the Patriarch and the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre could with justice be convicted of neglecting their pastoral duties. When these shortcomings were later brought vehemently to their notice, they argued that the Patriarchate of Jerusalem was not like other sees. In Jerusalem, they said, their first duty was to guard and maintain the holy places, for which they were responsible to the whole of Orthodoxy. Pastoral care took second place, and in any case, the Greek Orthodox population of Palestine contributed nothing to the upkeep of the see. Whatever the Patriarchate spent on them came from the bounty of the Orthodox world, and they had no right to question the actions of the Patriarch or to demand accounts. This situation, potential in estrangements and conflicts, began to be exploited by Russia in the 19th century. Ever since the Treaty of Kuchuk-Kanaja of 1774, Russia had been trying to penetrate the Ottoman Empire and establish therein a position of influence and dominance, and she found the Orthodox populations of the empire useful in furthering these designs. In 1842, a Russian archimandrite, Porfir Uspensky, whom Bertrand and Young describe as an ecclesiastic of peculiar propensities, was established in Jerusalem and continued there a number of years, ostensibly to look after the needs of Russian pilgrims, but it is clear that he also worked to advance Russian political interests, and to this end strove to establish a following among the local population. He set himself up as their champion and espoused their grievances against the Patriarchate. His reputation in this respect became legendary. Witness the stand he is made to take against the Greeks in an anti-Greek pamphlet published in Arabic in 1893. Your priests, says Uspensky to the patriarchal delegate, your priests are ignorant of their duties. Instead of instructing and training them when they come to see you, you spurn them like vile slaves. When they knock at the gates of the Patriarchate, imploring you in the name of our holy ancestors, your answer is, get out of here, take yourselves off. The Greek is made to say, we do not allow Arab priests to approach us because this would derogate from our episcopal dignity. As for their requests, the dragoman acquaints us with them. Uspensky, this is the first time in my life that I hear it said that the approach of a priest is derogatory to episcopal dignity. My lord, what mean these words? Greek, we do not understand their language. Uspensky, why not learn it? But let it be. Your age may no longer make it possible for you to study the language of the country, but why not allow the dragon man to set out the request of the native priests in their own presence? Greek, this is impossible. We cannot introduce new customs. With Russian help, then, the grievances of the laity and the lower clergy against the Patriarchate became crystallized as the grievances of Arabs against Greeks. In 1873, after Ouspensky's departure from Jerusalem, the Patriarch Cyril was deposed by the Jerusalem Synod for siding with Russia against the Patriarchate of Constantinople on the issue of the autocephaly of the Bulgarian Church. Russia was able to get up an agitation among the local populace against his dismissal. Bertram and Young quote a pamphlet published on that occasion under Russian influences, which accuses the Greek element, lazy and turbulent priests, of monopolizing the riches of the See of Jerusalem, which really belongs to the whole of Orthodoxy. As for the natives, the pamphlet adds, they may well be compared to that poor Lazarus of the Gospels, who was laid at the rich man's gate and who desired to be fed with the crumbs that fell from his table. Russia's championship of the native laity became most manifested in the See of Antioch in the 1890s when, with her pressure and diplomatic support, the Greek clergy were finally ousted from the See by coup d'etat and Arab clergy replaced them. As time went on, Russia worked powerfully and methodically to strengthen her influence in the Levant. After the Crimean War, a consul general in Jerusalem seconded with his authority the efforts of resident archimandrite, and in 1882, the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society began its operations. This society, whose patron was the Tsar himself and whose president was a Grand Duke, was founded to look after the needs of the Russian pilgrims in the Holy Land and set up hostels and hospitals for them. But it soon acquired other functions. It began to open schools and to train local teachers for the native Orthodox population. In 1886, a women's teachers' training college was opened at Beit Jalah. In 1889, a men's college at Nazareth. By 1898, over 6,500 pupils were in attendance at the society's schools. By 1912, there were 11,000 of them in more than 100 schools, and the society's expenditure amounted to 336,000 rubles. It is difficult to imagine nowadays the effect which such attentive solicitude had on the local Orthodox communities, what feelings of security and of pride were evoked in them by this tangible evidence of Russian care and protection, what vast horizons these schools opened and what new possibilities they conjured up in these hitherto neglected and almost forgotten communities. In his notable autobiography, 70 Years, the well-known Lebanese writer Mikhail Nuaimer describes for us his education as it began in a primary school founded and maintained in his village of Beskinter, Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, how it continued in the College of Nazareth, also at the expense of the society, and how excellence in his studies there took him on a scholarship awarded by the society to the seminary at Poltava. As he begins his chapter on the Beskinter School, which opened in 1899, Muscovy became our vernacular Muscovy, and Russia came to be known as the country as the Muskub. The Muskub is coming to open a school in Beskinter. May God give him victory. The news spread in the village as light spreads at dawn. The Orthodox community received it with songs of praise and glorification. And no wonder, it was something taken for granted among the inhabitants of the Lebanon in the era of the Mutasafarifa that Russia was the traditional protector of the Rum, France of the Maronites, Britain of the Protestants, and the Druses and Turkey of the Muslims. But Russia pushed her rivalry so far that she began opening free schools for the Rum in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. Schools, the curricula and administration of which were of the latest model, it made no condition on any Orthodox community which desired to have a school except it should provide a suitable building. As for the teachers, the books, the exercise, the books, the ink, the pencils, the furniture, the salaries and the administrative expenses, they were all free. For the first time in its history, Beskinter knew what may be called a model school. For the first time in its history, its girls began to study on an equality with the boys. The school had 5 schoolmasters and 3 schoolmistresses, presided over by a headmaster who had graduated from the Russian Teachers Training College in Nazareth and studied pedagogy and educational administration. For the first time, we felt we were in a school which had a curriculum and which was orderly. Of course, it was not the aim of the Russians to estrange the Orthodox of Palestine from their religion. They desired merely to estrange them from their religious superiors, but there was no way of circumscribing disaffection or of attacking persons without undermining institutions. We may illustrate this by an example from Nuaimer's autobiography. Nuaimer dwells at length on the official adulation of the Ottoman Sultan and the Russian Tsar, which was inculcated in the establishment of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society. The first surely a matter of prudence and policy, while the second was clearly the expression of affection and loyalty. Yet he also recounts that in the College of Nazareth, one of the teachers he most admired, Anton Balan from Homs, who had studied in Russia, was the first who wakened patriotic feeling in us. Whenever the opportunity offered, he used to tell us of the misery of our country under the Turkish yoke, of Abdelhamid's despotism, the crimes of the Bosporus, the corruption rampant in the Department of the State from the Sultan down to the lowest Mukhtar in the most insignificant village. If therefore the Arabs desired a life of some honour and independence, they had to regain possession of their lands and their stolen liberties, and the Muslims among them had to take back the usurped caliphate, since the caliphate belongs exclusively to the Arabs. It may be true that what came at the hands of the Russians was anyway inevitable and would have been accomplished at others' hands, that the unbending obscurantism of the hierarchy and their foolish contempt for their pastoral charges would sooner or later have led to an explosion. But the fact remains that it was principally Russian action on a young generation of Palestinian Orthodox which led the way to further developments, and that it was Russian efforts which made the quarrel between laity and clergy a definite and inevitable quarrel between Arabs and Greeks. A new generation grew up bitter at the pitiful spectacle of their community, resentful of the corrupt hierarchy which ruled them, contemptuous of their spiritual directors, and convinced that only a radical parting with tradition would ameliorate their condition. Tradition was mute or gave a hateful sound, and therefore abstract principles, brought to them by missionaries and educators, had to replace and do the work of tradition. The younger generation were men of principles, and that they were young and in revolt against the old only made their radicalism more radical. Finally, this radicalism became a built-in political attitude because these men of principles had nothing but principles. They did not claim authority on behalf of classes and interests, but because they were educated men and knew the right answers. They were lawyers or school teachers in a society where such occupations were meagerly and precariously rewarded, and those who followed them little respected. For instance, again and again in his diary, Khalil Sakakini complains of financial insecurity and the low standing of his profession. Shall I, he writes, while on a visit to America, go back to my native land, go back to teaching in schools and private houses, to witness every day such painful sights that my life becomes a hell? He decides to go back, and a few months later we find him in Jerusalem complaining. I wish I could find work in Jerusalem, but how is this to be done since I am Orthodox? The English bishop wants me to put on the clerical dress, to accompany the pupils to church and read the Bible. The Church Missionary Society wants me to become a missionary, and I can do neither. The passage of the years does not seem to improve his condition. In 1919, his finances are as precarious as ever. It is a long time now, he writes in April 1919, that my pocket is empty and I possess nothing. We live on our own provisions at home. I borrowed a quarter of a lira today. He gives Arabic lessons to British officers and one day earns 25 shillings from these lessons. This, he writes, is the highest income per day I have earned in 25 years of teaching, and all the while, whether under the Ottoman or the British regime, he is at the forefront of radical agitation. The fervent created by the Young Turk Revolution gave the new men that opportunity. Article 3 of the Ottoman Constitution, restored in July 1908, made provision for the setting up of local communal councils to supervise the administration of communal property and the use of revenue therefrom. In September 1908, a delegation of priests and laymen, basing itself on this article, announced to the Patriarch that a communal council had been formed to control the finances of the Patriarchate. The Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre vehemently rejected this, whereupon meetings, demonstrations, and riots against the Greeks took place in Jerusalem and elsewhere, and Greek monks were ousted from monasteries. The Ottoman government had to interpose itself between the contending parties. It appointed a commission to investigate the dispute and engaged in patient negotiation, inducing the parties to accept the compromise of a mixed council composed half of laymen and half of clergymen to supervise certain departments of patriarchal activity. The outlook of the leaders of the revolt against the Patriarchate is illustrated by Sakakini's diary. When the Young Turks came to power, Sakakini returned to Jerusalem from America. Whether he had gone to engage in business to earn a living less precarious than school teaching offered, the journey was not a success, and he came back confirmed in the moral superiority of education over mere practical skills. Commerce, he wrote, requires capital, and nobody will succeed in it unless he relies on deceit, trickery, and similar practices, to which I would sooner prefer death by hunger. He was indeed prepared to concede that in Western countries, wealth might be the reward of competence and poverty the sign of incapacity, but in Palestine, poverty was almost a badge of honour, a cause for pride, a token of dignity and self-respect. In his eyes, then, and in the eyes of those like him, the Young Turk Revolution appeared as a great deliverance from the small, mean, constricted world in which their education and their ideals were mocked and misunderstood. Now, he exclaimed, when the Constitution was announced, now I can serve my country. Now I can found a school, a newspaper, and societies for youth. Now we can lift up our voices without impediment. These voices were soon raised against the patriarchate. We are rid of the tyranny of the government, proclaimed Sakakini, but that of the spiritual authority still remains. He became a leader in the struggle. He organised meetings and processions, sent emissaries to other communities in Palestine, drafted petitions to the government, and argued with the patriarchate. When the patriarch Damianus, who had shown himself somewhat conciliatory towards the native community, was deposed by the Brotherhood, Sakakini was elected as a member of a delegation which went to Istanbul in January 1909 to protest against deposition. He even imagined, rightly or wrongly, that he was being personally persecuted for his activities. When a few years afterwards, in 1912, he wanted to marry, no priest in Jerusalem was willing to officiate, all alleging that the proposed marriage was within the prohibited decrees. Sakakini attributed this to the malice of the patriarchate and went off to Jaffa, where a priest was found to perform the ceremony. His attitude to the struggle was characteristic. Its object was not to obtain concessions but to vindicate principles. From the very beginning, he was afraid that his associates might be tempted and corrupted by concessions regarding schools, hospitals, and the training of priests, and similar matters, which after all constituted the substance of the community's grievance against the hierarchy. I noticed, he wrote in September 1908, that members of the committee preferred to give their attention to questions affecting schools, hospitals, the church, and other financial matters, and I became afraid that this might distract the community from pursuing its other rights. When a few years later the excitement died down and the contestants settled down again to a kind of acrimonious and suspicious intercourse, Sakakini decided to announce his abandonment of the reform movement and his secession from the church. My soul revolted, he records, and I saw that I could not stay any longer in the Orthodox community. I cannot stay under the authority of these corrupt and degenerate priests. I cannot be a member of this degenerate community. I am not Orthodox. I am not Orthodox. He had decided that the case of the church was hopeless, that it was not to be reformed, that secession was the only step practicable. However, hatred and contempt manifested themselves not only for the Greek hierarchy, but for the rites, traditions, and religious life of the Orthodox community. Anyone who stands at the gates of a church, reads an entry in 1918, will not think himself standing at a place of worship. He will see children playing gaily in the churchyard. He will see bands of young men here and there exchanging jokes and pleasantries, as though at a party or a circus or a dance hall. The candles, the incense, the chanting, the beauty of the vestments merely awaken feelings of joy and approbation, nay, feelings of love and desire. This is perhaps a survival in the Orthodox Church, a traces of ancient Greek religion, of the worship of Bacchus, the god of wine. I wrote on this subject at the time of the Orthodox awakening, which greatly agitated the priests of the Jerusalem Patriarchate, and impelled the Patriarch to publish an official notice excommunicating me and warning the community against frequenting me and listening to my opinions. The dislocation, as may be seen, is radical. Sakakini broke violently loose from the beliefs of his community, repudiated its manner of life, and rejected what practical wisdom he had accumulated in its long history as a minority under Islam. No doubt the heritage was poor, and to have seen what Western civilization could offer was enough to justify intellectual rebellion, but in Sakakini's case, as in that of his friends and contemporaries, the rebellion itself was a poor affair, fervent no doubt, but disoriented and undiscriminating. These men of principles who acclaimed the leadership of their community clutch now at this, now that their principle, and ended by involving themselves in a style of politics as devoid of charity as a principle. I am, exclaimed Sakakini, neither a Christian, nor a Buddhist, nor a Muslim, nor a Jew. I am neither an Arab, nor a Frenchman, nor a German, nor a Turk. I am a member of humanity. You, he tells a missionary, derive your principles from revelation, accepting them without scrutiny, while I derive them from myself, my mind, and my daily life and experience. These principles fluctuated alarmingly. One day he advises his son to be a pacifist, and 3 days later he exclaims, "Power, power! This is the new gospel, which we must spread. He who is stronger in body, mind, and spirit has a greater right to exist than he who is weak. The strong shall inherit the earth," and he again advises his son to adopt this philosophy. Traditional law and learning is thus rejected, and an eager, incoherent grasping at the latest novelty takes its place. This is best illustrated by Sakakini's attitude to Judaism. Estrangement and mistrust are, of course, the traditional attitudes of the different religious communities in the Middle East towards one another, But these traditional attitudes were never complicated by the kind of doctrinaire refinements which accompany modern European anti-Semitism, and much of these traditional attitudes have survived in and may be illustrated in Muslim writings about Zionism. These writings provide an ambiguous picture of admiration and contempt, of attraction and repulsion. Jews are cowardly, yet an example of courage. They are the scum of the earth, yet worthy of imitation in their social arrangements. Jewesses with uncovered faces, arms, and legs are infinitely attractive, yet an unholy temptation to believers. Take a book on Zionism written by two Muslim journalists for a popular audience and choose, almost at random, one of the many luscious descriptions of Jewish girls. Here is a girl from Hungary, her face radiant with fascination and allurement, that sex appeal, which the male sex dreams of flowing from her body. She is in conversation with two companions, legs crossed, slightly leaning back so that her skirt gives a glimpse of glittering lights and cool, firm flesh. And here is a gazelle, languorously lying on the rocks, intimating the softness and the yielding firmness of the flesh of the daughters of Eve. And yet their admiration for the modesty, neatness, and discretion of women going about the streets is also unbounded. They contrast them to the lazy, useless, heavily made up wives of Damascus. They present an idyllic picture of family life among the Jews. Outside the house there was a white cot, covered with a white, clean, billowing mosquito net. Inside was the baby daughter of our host. There, in the open air, in sunlight, in the midst of nature, the wife was a German blonde, mature and pretty. The couple appeared from the first glimpse to be completely fitted for each other. He was calm and good-tempered. She was orderly and obedient. By God, if one of us had this young woman, distinguished by her good looks and her smartness, she would have been a tyrant to her elderly husband and made his life unbearable hell. The lurid charms of the Jewesses seem in fact to have become a stock in trade of Arab publicists writing on the state of Israel. An Egyptian journalist, for instance, who visited Israel, regales his readers of a report about the easy and uninhibited ways of Israeli women. All of them, he says, go about in very brief shorts which disclose the articulation between the thigh and the trunk, and in the evenings I used to see young men and women on the two sides of the street behaving as if they were in a bedroom. Israeli beauties sit waiting in the hall of the Dan Hotel in Tel Aviv, and if you should pull one of them by the hand, she would get up and go with you anywhere. An anti-Nasser pamphlet, again disseminated by the Muslim Brethren after June 1967 war, taunts the Egyptian president with having so mismanaged things that the fighting daughters of Israel can now swim naked in the Suez Canal in your sight and hearing. Or take quite a different book, a polemic against non-Muslims written by a well-known leader of the Muslim Brethren, Muhammad al-Ghazali. He attacks the view that the Bible is all divinely inspired. Have you heard these inspired verses in the Holy Book? I fear that you may be a young man with burning desires, and these lurid pictures might wreak havoc on your conscience. How strange these sacred verses through which glides the snake of sexual love, agitated and excited, as though dancing to the rhythm of a tainted music. And to clinch his point and to gratify his readers, Al-Ghazali proceeds to quote several verses in the Song of Songs, and yet he also holds up as an example to the divided and incompetent Arabs the energy and resourcefulness of the Jews. In spite of this contrast, there are mouths which open, oh, how I wish they would have been stuffed with actions and say, we are the descendants of noble-born heroes, and these are the rejects of the world. What is this blindness? These attitudes, ambiguous as they are, seem yet innocent of European anti-Semitic doctrines. They derive from Muslim conditions, from the inaccessibility of Muslim women, and the shock administered by the victory of an inferior group hitherto held in contempt. As for anti-Semitism, there was no doubt that in its traditional theological variety, so well known in Europe, it was increasingly propagated in the Middle East through the 19th century by the indigenous Christian communities who were in many cases confirmed in their prejudices by European indoctrination. No doubt the increasing prosperity and assertiveness of the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, their rivalry with the Jews in economic affairs, the greater ease of travel, the greater availability of cheap books and newspapers all contributed to an increase in tension between Jews and Christians in the 19th century. By 1800, a contemporary observer noted, Jews hardly dared to enter, much less live in those towns of the Bosporus which had a heavy Greek Orthodox population, who believed that they had acquired merit by inflicting whatever injury they could upon the Jews. Holy Week was particularly dangerous, and on Good Friday, the effigy of a Jew was paraded and burnt publicly in order to atone for the original sin of the Hebrew nation. The century is punctuated with reports of Christian, frequently Greek Orthodox, anti-Jewish outbreaks in Rumelia, Anatolia, Syria, and Egypt, most frequently occasioned by the blood libel, and Orthodox in Beirut describes for us the anti-Jewish legends currently in his community. I was not to stray away from my guardians, not even a few yards, because the cursed Jews might steal me and murder me. I was told that the sons of Abraham feasted on the blood of Christian children. Several instances were mentioned to me when Christian children known to my kindred had been captured in the Jewish quarter in Beirut and bled to death by those enemies of Christ. My flesh crept and crawled when the process of bleeding was described to me. The traditional beliefs acquired a new lease of life with the increase in literacy and the propagation of European books, which seemed to confer on these beliefs all the authority and prestige of Europe. Thus, we find the erudite Chaiko commending in the Learned Journal, which he edited, a French work rehearsing the familiar blood libel of 1840 in Damascus, in which the French consul took so sinister and murderous a part. The book, writes the Reverend Chaiko, sets out the horrible crime of the Jews in seeking time and again to bleed once a year a Christian in order to mix his blood with their Passover cakes. The true reports concerning this are countless. By this century, then, the traditional anti-Jewish themes of Christian theology became widespread and popular in a way in which they had never been in the Middle East ever since Byzantium and St. John Chrysostom's incendiary sermons in Antioch, but they now also became jazzed up by the introduction of a modern European theme, that of scientific anti-Semitism. Anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism now fed on each other and provided arguments for anti-Zionism. Maron Abud, explaining how natural anti-Zionism is to him, says, "Do not forget that our hatred for God's chosen people flows in our veins. We curse them in our churches, and always we abuse them in our prayers and masses." Another Lebanese writer, the Orthodox George Hanna, exemplifies the transition from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism when he tells us in his autobiography that the terroristic, or al-Habiyah, teachings of the Old Testament used to capture his imagination as a schoolboy, before it began to be subjected to the tolerant teachings of the New, and he adds that it is part of the Zionist conspiracy to spread knowledge of the Bible in order to gain the sympathies of non-Jews. However virulent, ecclesiastical anti-Judaism would never have described any part of the Bible as terroristic in its teachings, and it is clear that George Hanna is superimposing on the anti-Judaism which he had no doubt imbibed in his boyhood a later and quite different doctrine. There was little doubt that this modern doctrine of anti-Semitism was propagated in the Middle East before the Palestine War in 1948 from European and Western sources, frequently through the intermediary of native Christians, who themselves in many cases were already predisposed to its acceptance by the anti-Judaism with which they were already acquainted. An interesting and opposite example lies to hand. The American millionaire Charles Crane, who was George Antonius' patron, was a votary of the fashionable anti-Semitism according to which the Jews were ruining the world with their atheistic communism, and therefore an admirer of Hitler and Nazism. We see him diligently endeavouring to propagate this belief among Muslims, employing Antonius to arrange meetings with such Muslim notables as Haj Amin al-Husseini, Rashid Rida, Ahmed Shafiq Pasha, Mustafa and Ali Abdal Razik, and Mustafa al-Maraghi, where he endeavoured to awaken them to the dangerous Jewish campaign against religion and private property, and to convince them that the arrival of Jews in Palestine was only another move in the anti-God campaign which had started in Russia and elsewhere, and by which they hoped to accomplish their program of annihilation. In Sakakini's case, too, the traditional anti-Judaism, based on religious grounds, is certainly present. "It seems to me that you Jews," he says to a Zionist, "are most in need of divine scriptures, but I fear that the prophet among you today will suffer the fate of his predecessors, whom you killed and burned. The prophets and holy scripture have come from you, but they are not for you." But this anti-Judaism is yet laced with more novel doctrines borrowed from Europe, as usual in an incoherent and contradictory fashion. Thus, Sakakini considers that Judaism makes its followers soft and unmanly. The Jews in their festivals lament and weep. Muslim festivals, on the contrary, are rousing events. If the nation is to have festivals, let them be like the Muslim ones. Let us have nothing but rousing songs, let us dance to swords. And yet, far from encouraging spirituality, the God of the Jews is a nature deity. If you compare Judaism and Christianity, you will find that the God of the Old Testament is the God of nature, while the God of the New is the God of reason. The God of the Old Testament says, "Multiply and fill the earth, and may your progeny be like the stars of heaven or the sands of the sea." In other words, the God of the Old Testament is the God of procreation. This doctrinaire anti-Semitism, difficult to reconcile with traditional Islam, as has been said, seems to have been introduced to the Middle East mainly by Eastern Christians, who had easier access to Western literature, but not enough judgment to exercise critical and discriminating choice. The point may be illustrated by a lecture in the Department of Public Administration of the University of Beirut by a Director General of the Lebanese Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Fawad Amun, a Maronite. Warning America against the Jewish peril, the speaker quoted an alleged speech of Benjamin Franklin's at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. warning the Convention against the admission of Jews to America. If they did not take the necessary measures, Franklin is said to have warned his colleagues, they would be cursed by their children and grandchildren. But this speech is not by Franklin, it is a forgery widely circulated by Nazi propaganda in the United States during the 1930s. The disorientation was not only intellectual but also practical. Political action, which to their ancestors was an unprofitable and evil necessity, began to seem to the new men an exciting game in which no stakes were adventured or hostages risked, but the rewards of which were ample and sure. After the Young Turk Revolution, Sakakini was asked by the local Committee of Union and Progress to join the secret society. He agreed, and with melodramatic ceremony, involving masked men, revolvers, etc., was made a member. He swore an oath to defend the fatherland and the constitution of his life, if need be. He remarked to his sponsor that he had really taken this oath at birth, and on this night was merely renewing it. A few weeks later, he was asked to join another secret society, that of Arab Brotherhood, which was directed against the Committee of Union and Progress, and again Sakakini enthusiastically agreed to join. He had, it is true, occasional qualms about the new model politics, which his public actions and utterances recommended to his co-religionists and pupils. He was taken aback by the announcement of jihad when the Ottoman Empire ended the war, feared that an old spirit of fanaticism would be resuscitated. He confided to his diary that the Muslims were incapable of civic spirit, and that they were riven by family factions and would promote only family interests. He refused to post as director of Arabic broadcasting in 1935 because, as he told George Antonius, a Muslim would be preferable in this post. This, on the part of an Arab nationalist, votary of a doctrine which, if it meant anything at all, meant that among Arab religious differences were utterly of no account, is paradoxical, and in one who is himself not a Muslim, somewhat pitiful. Antonius, we are interested to see, shared the belief that Islam and the Muslims ought to have the primacy in Arab nationalism. In a letter of 1935 about Kawakibi to Muhammad Rashid Rida, he makes a curious and revealing statement. Kawakibi, he told his eminent Muslim correspondent, was working towards the two fundamental and related aims. I mean the revival of Arab nationality through the revival of Islam, without which the revival of Arabs can have no life. This attitude finds its paradigm in another Arabic-speaking Orthodox, Khalil Iskandar Kubrusi, who published before the Second World War a series of articles in the Muslim religious periodical in which he called upon his co-religionists to embrace Islam because it was the true Arab religion, and if they adopted it then all the Arabs would be Muslim and only the foreigners Christian. There was a letter from Sakakini to his son which gives us a glimpse of the inner insecurity and bitterness which these expressions of solidarity with these glorifications of Islam all too often masked. The letter was sent in 1932, and the son, who was then studying it in the United States, thought so highly of it that he translated it and distributed it among his friends, providing it with a preface in which he, among other things, he explained that his father never went to church because he feared to come out of there rebellious and because he feared to disturb the calm of his soul and the stability of his mind. Sakakini writes about a lecture he had given which seems not to have been properly appreciated. He burst out, "No matter how high my standing may be in science and in literature, no matter how sincere my patriotism is, no matter how much I do to revive this nation, even if I burn my fingers before its sight, as long as I am not a Moslem, I am not. If you desire to amount to anything, then be a Moslem and that will be peace." He tells his son that if the Muslims respect him, it is only because they think him more sympathetic to Islam than to Christianity and Europe, and because he has an erudite knowledge of Arabic and its literature. But if I were to struggle with a Muslim who is less founded in knowledge and heritage than I would not doubt that they would prefer him to survive. He confesses that whenever I think of you and your sister's future, I am alarmed for you, and concludes by wishing that his son's generation will be better off than his own, and that you will not return to this country until it has changed land for land and people for people, and when a man will be estimated by what he achieves, and not according to how he preserves those outsworn out-customs. But these forlorn and despairing accents are not heard in his public doctrine, which is clear and categorical. Religion is reactionary and divisive. A Muslim-Christian union and the advocacy of pan-Arabism ought to be the only policies of the Orthodox. A delegation of Orthodox from Jaffa to Jerusalem in March 1914 to propose the formation of a party for the defence of Christian interests. He opposed this and told them, "If your aim is political, then I do not approve it, because I am an Arab first of all. I think it preferable that we should form a national party to unite all the sons of the fatherland regardless of religion and sex, to awaken the national feeling and infuse a new spirit. As for temples," he wrote at the same time, "they'll be transformed in time into societies or national schools, and instead of preaching on religious matters, they will be preaching on national matters." He gave a refuge to a man wanted by the Ottoman police, and wrote that he was only emulating his Bedouin ancestors for whom hospitality was a law. The man had not taken refuge with Khalil Sakakini, but with the Arab nation itself presented by one of its members. After the war, as a correspondent of the Egyptian newspaper Al Siyasa, he wrote a series of articles on Palestine and Zionism, which he later collected and published in a booklet. These articles also exhibit the extravagant and bombastic lengths to which he went in identifying himself with Muslim and Arab history. Apostrophizing the Jews, he says, "We conquered the world, founded illustrious kingdoms, actively built the foundations of learning, carrying high in our turn the banner of civilization. How can your history be compared to ours? The Arab nation was, and still is, warlike. If it finds nobody to fight, it will create an enemy in order to fight him. On our festivals, we dance with swords as though marching to war or victoriously returning from it. As for you, your festivals, this is not said to taunt you. Our festivals are mourning and lamentations from which you emerge with dulled senses and drooping spirits. How can the nation which knows naught but weeping stand fast in these swamps of death?" In 1919, he became a leading advocate of Pan-Arabism, agitation for which he was then being directed by the Sharifians in Damascus. In 1920, he resigned from the Education Department because the High Commissioner, Sir Herbert Samuel, was a Jew. In 1935, he built a house in Jerusalem and gave it from the name of an Arab capital. This is Sana'a, this is Damascus, this is Cordova, this is Baghdad, this is Cairo. In the end, of course, all this fervour, which made the Orthodox an appendix to the pan-Arab campaign against Zionism, availed little. With it, as without it, the Orthodox could have had little say in the direction of events, which for a sizable portion of their community ended in disaster. It may be argued that they had remained aloof from the Zionist-Arab quarrel, and from the incompetent Muslim leaders they might not have become quite so involved in the catastrophe. But this is mere speculation. Something else may be said with more certainty. Sakakini was a teacher and educationist. His doctrine as well as his practice introduced political fanaticism into the classroom. Literature for him was a means for arousing national fervour among the young. Practice reinforced theory, for while a lecturer in the Teachers Training College has had led his students in a political demonstration against the government, at the summit of his official career, as Inspector of Education a few years before his retirement, he gave a lecture to the school teachers of Nazareth entitled "What is National Teaching and What is Wholesome Teaching?" He referred to a poem by Shorkey in which the sentence, "Nothing equals the fatherland," occurs. This sentence, the teacher said in answer to his inquiry, ought to be the title of the whole poem, and he told them, the teacher ought to tell his pupils, repeat this title 5 times, and then he ought to tell them, "Come, let us shout with all our might, long live the fatherland." Of Sakakini, this, therefore, can be said with certainty that, like other pedagogues of his time and place, he was a recruiting sergeant for the ignorant armies whose endless brawls now have the Middle East for a stage. So poor, so arid, so common a vocation hardly arouses interest, but these things are not what they seem. The frenzy, the assurance, the dogmatism did not spring fully armed from the brow of some fateful deity, nor were they the outcome of mere intellectual conviction. Obscure conflicts and dim torments fashioned them, and it is these rather than what they fashioned which deserve our attention and justify our curiosity.